All right, great. Welcome everyone. We are live on Facebook and live here on Zoom. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Tanya Harris.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm Tanya Harris. I'm so grateful to the cancer support community of Delaware, and in particular to Kate Anti-Savage for having me here today. And I'm delighted that all of you are here as well. Kate is very generously offering to move my slides along, so I'm going to be working with her on that. And we're going to have so much time for questions, so not to worry. But if you have a burning question that comes up during the presentation that you're worried you will forget, you can use the chat function to chat it in, and then Kate and I will sort of manage those questions when we get to our question and answer period. If it's like a burning question you gotta ask right when it comes up, you can raise your hand and we'll try and accommodate you during the presentation. When I do these kind of talks in person, it's much more collaborative, but I just want to be sensitive when we're, on Zoom and on Facebook to make sure that we get through the content and leave time for everything. So with that, we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. Awesome. Thank you. So I really appreciate all of you being here today. One thing that we generally have in common is the desire to avoid this topic. So kudos to you for being here. And if you're anxious, that's totally normal. I promise that you will leave here today with some concrete suggestions for steps you can take to feel more prepared for life's one guarantee that our lives will one day come to an end. We often have advance notice of our death, but not always. And that's why thinking through your wishes and documenting them ahead of time is prudent. Next slide, please. So death works like everything else. A little planning goes a long way. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through the basics about what I think of as a death doula in terms of getting your affairs in order. And then I'll also talk about the services that death doulas can provide, both like me and others, to support you in that process. So the next slide actually is an opportunity if you wanted to come off mute and let us know what makes you nervous about death. Why is talking about death so uncomfortable? Um, we have some here, so Kate will start putting them on the screen. So a big one for folks is who will take care of, whether it's a dog, whether it's kids, whether it's family, whether it's a house, whatever it is, right? That we all have some anxiety about who will take care of some things for us. That's one of the things that makes us so nervous. Dementia, that one especially hits me when I can't remember anything, right? I worry a lot about dementia. Saying goodbye is really hard. It's something we're not really given much training in doing. And so a lot of folks get pretty anxious about the notion of how do I possibly articulate what I want to say to people before I leave. And then just leaving. It's hard to leave. It's hard for us to leave all kinds of things. And so it certainly can feel hard to think about leaving the earth and going into the great unknown that lies ahead. And then pain is a big one for many of us, me included. The very worst case scenario is being in sort of an incredible amount of pain. So is there something else that you might think of that is part of what makes you nervous about death and talking about death? Does anyone feel brave enough to come off mute and volunteer anything that we didn't list here? Yeah, Nina.
That my family won't honor my wishes, even though they are
Oh,
very clearly written down and have been for years.
that's a
But
great one.
when it comes to the very end, that they won't honor them.
Yeah.
It was a good. No, actually, it was kind of a funny story. Is thank God my dad was my first coach because I was a horrible player. I guess with your dad's the coach, you can't get forced for horrible. Serious. Yeah, yeah. In fact, my father said he says, man, you couldn't skate. You just kept falling down. But he saes one thing, you always got back up and got. I'm nervous that I'll be a
gasping for breath before I die because I have lung cancer. And I
Uh-huh.
don't know at what stage I will lose my breath.
Yes. Yes. Losing breath is terrifying. Thank you for sharing that. That's a good one, and something that certainly makes folks nervous who have breathing challenges. Thank you. Anything else?
I guess I'm nervous about my family and, who's going to take care of the things I normally took care of for them.
Yes.
I want them to have a smooth, wonderful life after I'm gone.
Yes.
And
Yes.
sometimes they don't want to listen. They don't want to talk about my death.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I want them to know that I want them to be taken care of after I'm gone. And it's hard that they don't want to talk about it.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for bringing that up. It is really hard because many times, particularly if we're a little closer to death than those around us, we're a lot more willing to have those conversations. And we're thinking a lot more about preparations and specifics than the people around us may be thinking of. That's one place where, one of the only alternatives that we have is simply to write it down. That doesn't mean they'll honor it, right? But we write it down so that that information sort of exists somewhere so that folks can find it later if they're unwilling to talk about it now. But that's another great one um, to mention. Any others?
I worry about my husband. Um, sorry, I can't talk about it.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Yes, that happens a lot, worrying about spouses, how they will sort of function in the world without us, how they will hopefully thrive. Um, But, also sometimes it's a little more prosaic, like how will they feed themselves? How will their laundry get done? So it sort of depends. Was there something else?
Well, he's sort of a very shy,
Mm,
a kind of a little bit of a recluse, and
okay.
I just worry that you know, he just doesn't have the social network that I have, and
Yeah.
I just worry about him being alone
Yep.
and people not reaching out to him after. I mean, they will probably initially, but after a while they won't.
Yep.
And what's going to happen to him? And I also worry about what's going to happen to him in this socio-political climate of ours, which is
Yes.
so seems to be so threatening to everybody.
Yeah. No, thank you. Then thanks for coming back off mute to share that. I think that's another common one because we have, as women, we tend to have a more robust social network than the men in our lives, and so they can get quite isolated. And so, some of the things there, I'm sure you thought of grief support groups, other sort of venues that they may have that, even for the more reclusive of us, may allow them to sort of be in companionship with others. But spouses are a particularly sensitive spot for many of us as we think about the end of life. Anyone else want to weigh in before we keep going? Thank you for all of that. Those were really, really helpful responses. Okay. So we'll go on to the next slide. It's time to tell you a little bit about me, so you have some idea who you're talking to today. I don't tend to read my slides because you can read the slides. So I'm going to keep talking about myself, but you'll see all the information here on the slides as needed. So I do this work really because I have seen how death can be beautiful and I have seen how death can be less than ideal. I've worked with people. The real formative experience I had was quite young in my life, like very early, my first job out of college. I was working and I had a client, and I walked into the hospital ward where he was inpatient, and the resident sort of marched up to me and said that Thomas, my client, was delusional. And he was in the hospital for a flesh-eating virus, and this was on top of a lot of really terminal chronic illnesses. And I said to the resident, okay. And I went and I sat with Thomas, and he said, do you have any drugs with you? And I said, no. And I said, why? And he said, well, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to die. And I said, well, then you don't need anything from me. You can just let go. And we sort of sat and had that conversation for a period of time in this hospital ward. And then I left and said, our final goodbyes. And he died the next day. And I felt like, oh, there's sort of ways you can do this. There's ways we can talk about it openly. There's ways we can sort of have some autonomy in the midst of a very disempowering process of being chronically ill and terminally ill. So I've really learned from all the experiences I've had working with people at end of life, and just believe that this can be transformatively beautiful for not only the individual who's passing, but also for their loved ones. The other thing that I've done that sort of brought me and called me to this work was I was a caregiver for a dear friend whose life was saved. Literally, he stayed alive an extra 2 years because we moved him into hospice out of chemotherapy. And so he could focus at that point for him on quality of life rather than quantity. And so ever since then, I've been volunteering with hospice programs for I think 12 years and counting now. And I really find being with people at this time is a really profound gift. It can be a powerful time, it can be a healing time. And it's really been my honor to be present for people as they approach death and to support the bereaved, which is part of what we do as death doulas. We provide support both for the individual who's dying and for their family and loved ones. And I'll talk a little bit more about what we do as doulas a little bit further in the presentation. So we can go on to the next slide. So this is what we're going to go over. I'm going to just go through the basics. Some folks will find this remedial and you'll know a bunch of this stuff. Some folks won't. Some of this information will hopefully be new to you. Some of it may not be. And then we'll leave, as I said, plenty of time at the end for questions. But if you need to ask a question during, you can pop it into chat or raise your hand if you feel like it's really urgent. So the next slide, we'll sort of take a big breath here. So I just encourage everyone to remember to keep breathing as we get into the tough stuff around the logistics. And these are what I think of as the big three, and they're big for a reason. So if you leave this presentation today with anything, let it be these questions. If you can answer these affirmatively, you're in a good place. You're well prepared. So we'll go through the documents themselves in a few slides, but there's plenty to think about in terms of what it means to have your affairs in order. Basically, your stuff, right? Not just which of your kids gets the car or the jewelry or the house. I'm talking online accounts and passwords, bills you pay online, social media accounts. Ideally, you'll add a second person, perhaps your financial power of attorney, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, as an authorized user on your online accounts. It will save them so much time later. You can also designate someone to whom financial accounts are transferred after death, which can help avoid going into probate. Where to die seems fairly straightforward until you realize that 35% of us die in a hospital and another 27% in nursing home or hospice. So the odds are a little bit against dying at home unless it is communicated with your care team early and often. And then what about after you're gone? You don't have to make any decisions about what happens after you're gone, but many of us do have an idea of what we want. A religious service, a big party, both of those things, neither of those things. Many of us make decisions about organ donation when we receive our driver's license, and you probably know or have an idea of what you want to happen to your remains. But consider today the encouragement to write all of these things down and tell your loved ones and communicate with them regularly. So, to the point that was raised earlier about wanting to ensure that folks honor wishes, the more formally they're written down, the more likely they are to be honored. So, the next slide, please, Kate, which is really just to highlight that your search history, your old love letters, your emails, your photos of whatever you have photos of, your diaries, your journals. If you don't want other people seeing these things, you should dispose of them. Or if there are particular people that you're willing to have manage these things, to plan ahead for that. simply to preserve your privacy and integrity. So, for many of us these days, this can be stuff that occurs on the internet, but it can also be, sort of hard copy papers and letters and photographs and whatever it is. So I just like to encourage folks to really think about what are the things that you don't want other people finding, and how might you tend to those things so that they are only found by trusted people, and if they or if not, they're things that you dispose of. So the next slide, this is basically the paperwork. I imagine this may be familiar to many of you. I recently read how Warren Buffett recommends discussing your will with your children and significant others before you sign it to mitigate any confusion or ill feelings. It's an interesting theory, right? It allows you to explain your rationale and engage your family in planning. So that's just one thing to think about. If you have a will and nobody knows what's in it, you may choose to share it with people and talk to people about it in advance, so there's not surprises, so that folks are well aware. The advance directive allows you to indicate your wishes around medical interventions you do and don't want. The Pulse DNR, you can have these at any age, indicating you don't want to be resuscitated, but it's generally used with people who are ill or elderly. And then we get to the healthcare power of attorney and financial power of attorney. These are two separate people that you should think about having to designate to manage different aspects of your life. A healthcare power of attorney to make medical decisions if you're unable to do so, and a financial power of attorney for all the bureaucratic stuff we were talking about on the previous slide. In terms of finding these documents, sorry, just one second. If you could go back. Thanks. These documents are pretty easy to find online. Some need to be signed in front of witnesses or notaries, but you can update them at any time. If any of this seems overwhelming and you want help, that's part of how I can support you as a doula. I can walk you through the forms. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm familiar with completing this paperwork. There are also a variety of other resources available that can help you sort of get through this process and these documents. Now that you can go to the next slide. Thanks, Kate. As I mentioned earlier, you may have a very clear vision in your head of what you want at your funeral, but it's great to communicate that verbally to your loved ones as well as in writing. One of the things I've recently learned about and have been working with some clients on is the idea of a living funeral, which seems to me like a pretty fun idea, so that you can be there when people say nice things about you, so that you can participate in that, you can be present as people are appreciating you and thinking about you. If you're familiar with Tuesdays with Maury, Maury chose this option to do a living funeral. As a death doula, I can help plan your event, whether it will occur before or after your death, and even serve as your officiant. Next slide, please. So this is an area where things are really evolving in terms of the way that we think about sort of disposing of remains and how things would work. So traditional burial is pretty familiar to folks, but have you purchased a plot? Have you communicated your wishes to anyone? Do folks know where you want to be buried? Is that prepared? So that's something to think about for the traditional burial route. Natural organic reduction is newly legal in Delaware and essentially a way of sort of composting human remains. So I don't know that any providers are actually doing it yet, but it has just become legal in the state. There is sort of traditional cremation. Again, that's something that can be prepared a little bit in advance, just in terms of the arrangements with a funeral home. One thing that will happen with cremation is there is a lot of opportunity to have remains embedded in jewelry or in sort of various tokens and memory things. So there's like brochures worth of information about that. So that's surely something that will be offered to loved ones as a way to honor someone's memory and to maintain some of those ashes in some sort of form. Alkaloid cremation is basically using water instead of heat for the cremation purpose. It's considered to be more environmentally sensitive. So that's something else that's starting to happen in the world of cremation and funerals. And then the is there's also thinking about in the cremation space, is there a specific place you want your ashes to be scattered? Are there directions you want to leave for family and friends and loved ones about what to do with any remains? And then the other thing I'll say on remains, I know even here locally in Ocean City, remains can be put in like a sort of man-made reef that they've built in the ocean. And so there's the opportunity to put the ashes in sort of, I think it's like a brick. I'm not exactly sure what size it is, and then that can be decorated and folks can go out on the boat when that sort of piece is dropped into the reef. So there are a variety of things that one can do with ashes now, and creative ways to think about that. I do believe that some is sent into space. So, one can do many things with ashes. And so that's just something to think about. There's sort of as many options as you can imagine. And then, of course, there is the capacity to donate one's body to science to be used by medical students and others.
Tanya, on this topic, we had a question on Facebook Live. Can
Yep.
one decide to do both, be an organ donor or be organ donor to science plus be cremated?
Yes, it's a great question. So, organ donation is a little easier because that's so quick, right? So, in order to harvest organs, that happens pretty much, within a very short period of time, and then the body is returned to the family and can be cremated or disposed of in whatever way they please. Donating a body to science usually means it's a longer period of time where the body will be used for scientific purpose it's usually for sort of teaching purposes. And then it's a matter of just talking with the entity about sort of what that length of time is. And, presumably after that length of time, they would be willing to return the body so that it can be disposed of in whatever way the family sees fit. So that's my understanding of how that works.
I've heard that if you have cancer, you can't donate organs.
Well, that may be so. I think it sort of depends on the organs, but that may be so that there is not organ donation for cancer, for folks who are living with cancer. I don't know that that's always true. I would imagine a little of it would depend on organs and what was implicated in the cancer, but that's something that, can be talked.
And also your other said that your other slide said that if you donate your body to science or organ donation, you can't die at home.
Correct. Correct. For organ donation, yes, that is 100% true. That because the organs need to be taken very, very quickly before, so that is 100% true. That you
You
cannot
have to
choose to.
die in the hospital.
Yes, you'd have to die in a facility. Thanks for that. That's Carol, that's really important. And then we have someone in chat saying that if you're donating your body, you can't also be an organ donor except for eyes, which makes sense because they're probably looking for the body parts to be there in the training they do with medical students. So thanks for both of those additions. That's really helpful. Anything else on this topic? Okay, the next slide, please. So this is one of the fun things, one of the sort of lighter pieces of things to think about at end of life. And so this is really about what we call in the doula trade like a legacy projects. And so when people are asked what they treasure most from their parents after their parents passed, it's keepsakes and memories. And as someone's nearing the end of their life, it may be a time where they can find it meaningful to use artistic skills or hobbies to create remembrances for loved ones. For other people, the act of simply reviewing one's life with a trained professional like a doula and having it transcribed and given to family members is a meaningful gift for family and friends. That's called a life review. So I'm happy to help with a life review or in thinking about sort of what skills you have that you'd want to share in some way with your loved ones as you at the end of life. So it can be that someone's a great cook and they want to write down and leave recipes for different members of their family. Or it could be that someone loves their Harley Davidson and wants to leave a lot of directions for how that gets maintained, how it needs to be cared for, and information they want to leave about their Harley and its maintenance to whoever they're gifting the motorcycle to. It can be written letters that are distributed before or after someone's death. It can be craft projects. The other nice thing about legacy work is we usually try and do this work in a way that's really conducive to someone who may not be very mobile anymore. So these are sort of things that one can do and think about and engage in that feel creative and constructive and like really proactive around sharing some of who we are with the people we love as we're sort of nearing the end of life. And so this is a very very specific sort of area where doulas can provide a lot of support and really sit with someone while the legacy projects are created and sort of help with that process. So we're almost done with the formal part of the presentation. So after we get through this, we're going to get to an opportunity to have more discussion and questions here in a minute. So the next slide is really about, next slide, Kate. Thank you. What is a death doula and what do we do? So here are the services that I provide. As a death doula, I didn't write death decluttering here because people tend to have really strong opinions about using that terminology, but it is a very kind thing to clean out your belongings rather than leaving them for others to wade through. And that's an area where I can help. Organizational support is helping with all the paperwork if it's given you the heebie-jeebies, if you just have been avoiding it because either you don't understand it or you don't want to deal with it and you could use a neutral third party. That's an area where I can support. Funeral planning is pretty self-explanatory, but because I have, sort of an understanding of lots of different traditions and cultures, I can help think about creative ways to make this ceremony and event feel more your own. Um, Emotional support is really, if you don't have a therapist and you don't feel like you can sort of sort through all that you're thinking about in a support group or in other settings, and you just like to have someone who's willing. I think someone said earlier, lots of our family members and loved ones don't really want to talk about death. And, if it's something that you're facing, it's on your mind. And so the nice thing about working with a death doula is it's someone who's perfectly comfortable talking about death as much as you would like. And so that may be an opportunity to just sort of have someone to talk things through with. And I can listen to your fears and talk with you about what I've observed from experiencing multiple deaths. It's an opportunity to kind of process the experience that you may be having in the end of life and to prepare for what's coming. The other thing that death doulas do is we provide support to caregivers. There's actually times where I'm hired and really just in service of the caregiver, not actually the person who is terminally ill. So it's just something to keep in mind that doulas can provide that support really focused on caregivers. And even if my role is I'm hired to work directly with an individual, I'm always mindful of and engaging the family and the caregivers that are around and providing support to them. So that is part of what I'm happy to do in these services. So I can provide sort of comprehensive support, which means I do all of these things. I can provide support by the hour, depending on what your needs are. I'm sort of flexible with whatever would work best for you. And then the next slide is just how you can reach me. I've got a website, I've got my phone number here and my email address. So these are all ways that you can find me if you have additional questions, if you'd like to chat about working together. I'm going to be in the area. I live in Southern Delaware. I'll be here until August and then I'll be moving. So after that, the services I provide would be virtual, would be via Zoom like this. But will continue to provide death doula services. The next slide is just, this is the front page of my website. And then finally, I just want to please ask you to keep in mind that while these topics can be difficult to discuss, they're really important. And I'm impressed and grateful to all of you for making it through this conversation. I hope it wasn't too uncomfortable. And now I'm really eager in chatting with all of you about what's on your mind and what questions you have and what things you're concerned about and how a death doula might be able to help. So we can pull down the slides, Kate, and just have a conversation.
All right, if you are joining us on Facebook Live, feel free to type any questions in the comments section, and then we'll be ending the live stream soon. So if anyone on Zoom had anything more personal to ask that you don't want recorded, just give us a minute or two, and then we'll end the recording in the live stream. But otherwise, you feel free to ask questions now if you don't mind them being streamed.
Anything that was surprising to folks? Any areas where you're particularly curious about or thinking about pieces?
Can you do all that without actually choosing the end of life? Can you do all that preparation for the end of life and then not go through with the end of life? As a death doula, do you have to administer the drugs to
Ah,
people?
great
Or can
question.
you just do all that preparation?
Great question. Great question. So, we do now we're just at the beginning of figuring out what medical aid in dying is here in the state of Delaware, right? We just got this passed in the last couple months. And so there's not a ton of information that I've seen yet about what that's really going to look like. So, although you would think that by calling myself a death doula, that my role is to be there at the moment of death, that's actually not necessarily what I do at all. So there are sometimes I am able to sit vigil with someone at the very end of their life, and there's sometimes where I'm not present at that moment at all. And so my role is really to support folks sort of before and to support families after. And then if it works out for all of us for me to be present, sort of during death, I'm absolutely happy to be present, but that's not always so in the way that the world works and the way that the timing is. So it's a great question, and I think a great clarification about what I do as a death doula. And I am absolutely here to support people as they go through a journey, and I may not be with them at the very end. So I think the answer is yes.
Well, my father is in Athens, Georgia, and he's in a rehab right now, but he has obviously given up. He had blood clots in his legs and in his lungs, and he won't move out of bed. He will not get out of bed to do anything. And he has told me that he wants to die and that he's given up. Now, can you fly down to Athens, Georgia, and talk to my father?
No, but we should talk afterwards because I'm happy to talk to him. If he's still
Okay,
able to talk on the phone, I'm happy to have a conversation and see if I can provide some support.
that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Of course, of course. Thanks for sharing.
I wrote down your phone number and your
Perfect.
name, so
Perfect.
thank you.
Of course. Thank you.
There was one question from Facebook. Before I end that, can you share costs and is there any insurance coverage?
Yes. So as doulas, we are not covered by insurances yet. This is a fairly new field. We're sort of following in the footsteps of our colleagues who are birth doulas, if you're familiar with that field. They are just starting to get health insurance coverage for their services, and they've been at this a good while. So we anticipate it'll be a minute before we are covered by insurance. So this is really sort of a cash business, but also because it is a business that most of us get into just because we care deeply about supporting people, we don't really like to turn people away because they can't afford to pay. So if you go to my website, you'll see the pricing that I've laid out for now in terms of what I'm able to support. But I always tell folks, like, if money is an issue, then let's just talk about it, and figure out how we can do something that might be helpful. I'm also happy to sort of have initial conversations with people. That initial consultation is free, and then we can figure out what makes sense from there. So I hope that answers that question.
At what point At what point do we know when it's time to call in a death doula?
That's a great one. Great question. And I think it's really, so what I tried to do with this presentation was sort of give you, here's the like basics that you have to have sorted that like I hope that if folks have the paperwork done, it at least alleviates some of the like anxiety about sort of leaving a mess behind, right? So I think there's sort of if you're stuck on the paperwork and you can't sort of get over the hump emotionally to get it done and you could use some help, I think that's a great place to bring in a death doula. I think when what I find often is that someone's really sort of starting to be in the last stage of their life. And I think, as a couple of folks mentioned earlier, the people around that individual may not be sort of willing or ready and able to have the conversations yet. And so it may simply be if you have a lot on your mind around this topic and a lot of worries and a lot of thoughts and you don't have anywhere to process them, then that's a great time to bring in somebody who can help. So it's less about sort of, are you at a certain medical point, where you suddenly need to have a death doula present, but really more for you as an individual. And right, we all are different. Some of us really like to handle things head on and upfront, and some of us like to procrastinate, and most of us are somewhere in the middle, right? So it's a matter of when does it feel like you have things that you want to sort through, or legacy projects you want to do, or planning you want to do, and you need some support in doing those things.
I'm going to stop the live stream on Facebook, but we can continue the conversation on here. But none of this will be recorded, so feel free to ask anything you'd like here.